Good afternoon. Welcome. It's a privilege to be here. Welcome all of you talking about such an important subject, which is revisioning rural development, a subject which is very close to my heart. But before I talk about it, I'd like to first just talk a little bit about CSEP and what we are all about. So on paper, we are a multidisciplinary, independent, non-profit think tank. We work on a whole range of areas. We have 100+ scholars, uh, and we essentially our job is to inform the discourse on public policy, on the potential alternatives that India has. Now, that's on paper, but what are we really? And so the way I see CSEP, it's an empowered space where scholarship stands at the core of all that we do. The and that involves dependence, evidence-driven work, and that also involves conversations. Conversations where we get inputs from across the civil society, industry, government. Uh, did I miss some? So essentially, a whole lot of stakeholders are included in this. Now, these conversations don't only inform our own scholarship, but they are also informed policy in ways that are very difficult to understand. But saying that a lot of our work essentially is all about uh, uh, encouraging such conversations. Uh, and rural development is something that we really need to have. I think independent conversations which are a bit different from the norm. Now, one particular thing which has been really striking these days is a strange narrative that growth rates or progress in rural India is slow, that in urban India productivity is higher. So let us shift people to urban India. I mean, that's a very strange narrative to have. Because as far as I understand, public policy is not about forcing an outcome. It's about creating the right set of incentives, the right environment for empowering people, for encouraging choices and alternatives. And hopefully this conversation will be about that, not about having growth as the primary objective. And we're very fortunate today to have a great panel with us, and thank you for being here. Uh, we have Dr. Jyotsna Puri. She is a globally recognized expert in climate finance, international development, and impact evaluation. With nearly 30 years of experience in the multilateral sector, she has held prominent leadership roles, including Associate Vice President of Strategy and Knowledge at IFAD and inaugural head of the Independent Evaluation Office of the Green Climate Fund, and currently serves as a strategic advisor to the President of IFAD. She also holds academic affiliation as an adjunct professor at Columbia University and a senior fellow at CSIS, Washington, D.C. Her pioneering work on resilience credit and evidence-driven policies continues to inspire transformative change in the development sector. Welcome. Mr. Saroj Mahapatra is an executive director of PRADAN. He brings more than 28 years of dedicated service in rural development, particularly in India's most marginalized regions. His expertise in participatory planning and natural resource management has been instrumental in shaping impactful government initiatives, including NREGA and the NRLM. His leadership and hands-on approach to community-driven development have transformed livelihoods in tribal pockets of central India, making him a leading voice in sustainable rural development. I have been some of those areas, and believe you me, it's amazing what you have deep there. Mr. Amarjeet Sinha, our very own, is a senior fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. He has spent many decades in the IAS with a focus on rural and social sectors. As a former secretary, Department of Rural Development, and advisor to the Prime Minister, he played a pivotal role in implementing flagship programs such as the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, National Rural Health Mission, and the Gram Swaraj Abhiyan. His contributions to multidimensional poverty reduction, public policy, and governance reforms have had lasting impact on India's development landscape. Currently, he continues to lead important research initiatives, which is, as we all know, on education and skilling. A lot of different kinds of studies are being conceptualized at CSEP. Currently, he continues to lead important research initiatives aimed at improving public service delivery and educational outcomes. Welcome, and may I ask you to moderate and start the session? Thank you.
Thank you, Lavish. Is the mic on?
Yeah, right.
There. they found out that. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Thank you so much. Thanks, Lavish, for that introduction. Friends, we have a very illustrious panel. And as always, as researchers say, you must get the macro view and the micro view. So Jyotsna will give us the macro view. Globally, where is the world headed on rural development? That's the task that she's currently working on. The perspective for the next 5 to 7 years for rural development globally. And we have Saroj, who works at the cutting edge level. And like Lavish, I've also had a chance to see the work that they do at the field. He will share a video film also to tell us more about the kind of work that they do. So we'll have the macro perspective, the micro perspective. If there's anything left thereafter, I'll attempt it at the end. May not be required. But, yeah. So without wasting any time, may I now request Jyotsna Puri? Your presentation has been loaded.
Yeah. Okay.
Jyotsna, wherever you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
You like to speak from the...
Yeah, if I could get a clicker, all I need is that. Okay. Well, first, thank you so much, Lavish, and thank you so much, CSEP, for having me here. It's such a privilege to be here. Well, even before that, my deep, deep apologies for being late. I hate being late, and I had completely forgotten about VIP closures on roads in Delhi, but it's completely my responsibility, and I'm really apologetic. So thank you so much for being patient and for welcoming me here so wonderfully and so warmly. Thank you so much to you, Saroj, and to you, Amarjeet, for being here and for being such, I feel really privileged to be part of this panel. So as our wonderful moderator just told us, what I want to try and do, and I do want to, while I speak, just set an alarm for myself so that I don't exceed my time. I want to give you a quick overview of what are some of the key emerging messages that we are getting from the work that I'm currently doing, which is on the 2025 Rural Development Report, which is titled Financing Rural Transformation, Some Solutions. And so what I want to do is actually get your wisdom on where we are, some of the directions, and hopefully generate a conversation. So so I'm Jo, and really privileged again to be here. So I think the first question is there a financing gap? Remember that the title of the overall report is Financing Rural Transformation. And we started with I have a team that I work with. And the first question is really, is there a financing gap at all? And what is it? And we thought, okay, well, there's a lot of data out there and we should be able to get that data quite quickly. And is it important to even finance it, right? So we started to look at it. And I just want to turn to you and sort of ask you a quick question first. Do you think there is a financing gap? I think the answer is yes, because I'm here. But what do you think is the magnitude? What do you think is the magnitude of that financing gap? Any numbers out there? Billions, trillions. Let's start with that. Trillions. Okay, great guess. Okay, so that I agree with. So now, approximate number, closest number gets a 10,000 points from me. 2 trillion. 10 trillion. Great. Okay, so I'm going to essentially reveal the answer here, but this is not for tweeting. We're still working through the numbers. But the overall financing need of for rural transformation in rural areas of developing countries, the needs are 7.5 trillion, but the gap, and here is the key idea, we realize that the glass is actually half full. Yeah? There is quite a bit of money that is going into rural transformation. Here's another quick quiz question. Who's the biggest donor or contributor of financing to rural development? Government. Great. Yes. So there is quite a bit of money that is going into rural development, but it's not enough. And actually, the magnitude of that gap in rural financing is almost half. Yeah. So that's, I think, one of the key messages that we want to get. The second idea we want to present is that, look, there are a lot of instruments and policies, but if we truly want to bridge that gap of approximately $3.5 trillion, we've got to change the way financing policies and instruments work. Yeah, and the key thing there is to reduce risk. Reduce risk because the perception of risk with respect to investment in rural areas is huge. Actual risk is actually quite low, but the perception of risk is very high. And the second is that the perception of what the returns, financial returns of investment in rural areas is actually far lower than what it is in urban. And that's what Lavesh was talking about. You know, we are seeing this gravitational pull almost that is being exerted on a lot of development pathways that are drawing you towards urban, thinking, oh, you have low transaction costs, you have lesser risk in urban, and you have economies of scale. So a lot of that financing is going towards urban. What I want to say, and what we want to say through this report, is actually the world has turned today. Because you have, one, decarbonization, you have low stranded assets in rural areas, so that's one. Second, because you have digital and tokenized economies now and people, you can actually build what are called e-scale economies. Precisely because you have a lot of agents in rural areas. And third, you have the opportunity to really build new markets in rural areas because they have been relatively unprivileged so far. Okay, we're also wanting to say, and we look through a lot of the literature to understand, well, transformation and rural transformation, that's a word that gets used a lot, but what is it? And can we visualize it? Because the definitions are really very academic, and I love the academic part of it. But to communicate it to someone who's walking on the road, what does it mean to be transforming rural areas? And so we thought of four, and we brought together a lot of the definitions that are being used in this area. But clearly, prosperity, i.e. income, equity. Thomas Piketty has told us that you've got to build in equity into the DNA of most growth processes right at the beginning. So equity and equitability cannot be ignored. Third, these areas should be resilient. They are being resilient not just for today, but for shocks, climate and non-climate shocks of tomorrow as well. And the fourth is they have to be connected. We cannot live in a world where rural areas are hugely divorced from the rest of the world. And that connectedness is almost like a human right? Whether it is virtual or whether it's physical connectedness. So this idea of prosperity, equity, resilience, and connectedness was something that we pulled out, and then we parsed a lot in terms of what it means to achieve that in rural areas of developing countries. One key thing I want to point out, rural areas, there is an urban bias in almost everything that is occurring. And again, Lavesh talked about this, but if you look at some of the numbers, and I'm going at this really, really quickly, essentially the population density in rural areas is 33 people per square kilometer, but in urban areas, 2,000, right? So you get economies of scale just by that. But the other idea is really the infrastructure investment. $40,000 versus $80,000 per capita, global average. Yeah, and many other things. But the important thing is also to recognize that employment rates and biodiversity rates, they're diametrically opposite in rural areas. So it gives you an opportunity to really invest. Now, here's my money slide. It's essentially saying that, look, there is a large gap. So the green parts are essentially in prosperity, equity, resilience, and connectedness. The green parts are the money that's already coming in. But the light green parts are the parts that remain to be funded. That's your financing gap. And that's the part that we've got to cover, the $3.5 trillion every year that we've got to really have. Most of this is coming in. If you want to make rural areas far more resilient, 70% is the gap. If you want to make it far more prosperous, there's a 60% gap just to get to that for rural areas. And this we're saying is indefensible. Okay, couple of other things. And we also parse this across all of the sectors that we traditionally work in, because obviously we work in ministries. Ministries have sectors, and whether we like it or not, there are silos that we have to work across. And so we parsed it across almost 15 sectors that are traditionally given ministries, right? And we found that basically 50% of the gap in food and agriculture is essentially uncovered right now. Yeah, 50%. And we've also found, and I'm going to change the side of my room, that 60% of the energy gap still needs to be filled as well. And so this is the energy gap. And I think so these are some of the key things that we're also parsing from the data as we are going along. I'm going to skip over this because I'm realizing that I have to make up. Yeah, these are all global. These are all with the 155 developing countries, but rural areas in developing countries. Yeah. And we're also realizing, of course, that there's a huge gap in ODA. The official development assistance, most of it, and you all know this, is actually getting displaced and moved towards humanitarian far more than it is going towards their food and agriculture or health. And that's something that really needs to be dealt with, because otherwise we're going to see rural areas being neglected yet again. The second point, and you mentioned this already, is that national governments tend to be the largest donors in rural areas or contributors. But the interesting thing, for me at least, was that when you look at the same numbers for least developed countries, national governments become a far smaller funder of rural areas compared to, say, the private sector. The private sector on average, 12%, but in LDCs, 20%. And here, of course, the private sector is also MSMEs, yeah? And it's also large commercial firms. So really accounting for all of the financiers across the value chain, the private sector becomes far larger. National governments, far lesser. The third thing that I really want to talk about is that, look, this $3.5 trillion that I'm mentioning, which is the financing gap of rural areas, is not all new and additional. So lest you think that, I'm sort of saying that, oh, well, all rural institutions should now go out and say, oh, we've got to galvanize $3.5 trillion. This is not all additional, because there is quite a bit of financing that is already being pitched for, say, by climate. Climate is asking for $2 trillion per year. Health, food systems are asking for approximately $260 billion. So if we said that at least half of this, and this is the sort of the headline message, if at least half of this were redirected in a way that was rural, half of all of this were redirected in a way that was intentionally rural, then actually what you would additionally need is only approximately $700 billion per year, only approximately. But that's an important point, right? This 3.5 trillion is not all new and additional. You can, if you started to redirect financing, start to then think about, okay, that redirection should be towards rural, and then your gap reduces a whole lot more. Yes, please.
Well, I think with all the investments required for environmental transition or the climate change in front, is there any link between that and this?
So yes, Lavish, there is. So currently, climate financing, actually $2 trillion, but most of it is going towards, say, renewables, right? And very little is going into adaptation. Now, if you shifted, say, that $2 trillion in a way that at least half of it is going towards adaptation, most of which would be in rural areas, then you'd get a redirection of that climate finance.
Precisely. So my question is, like, in food systems, health, education, in all of that, are these things interlinked or are these separate?
No, so none of these. So that's a great question. None of these sectors talk to each other, right? Food systems doesn't account for, oh, well, are we overlapping with climate or not? If you go and speak to FAO, which is where this data is, they say, we don't care about climate. In the UNFCCC And GCF will talk about climate financing, but they don't talk to FAO to figure out how much of it is climate. So that's what, so they're not mutually exclusive categories, but that's why we want to point out that, look, if at least half of these, excluding biodiversity, most of biodiversity financing will go into rural, because 37% of all biodiversity actually lies in rural areas. So, and urban areas have zero biodiversity, by the way. So that way, if you started to redirect and at least assumed, and we did sensitivity analysis, then you could start to. But the agencies themselves, who are custodians of this data, don't talk to each other. And that's the other dialogue we're trying to. Okay, so then the other question is, what instruments can be used, right? What instruments can be used so that we can truly redirect this financing? And we used several criteria to try and understand this: leverage ratios, additionality, impact, and return on investment. And we analyzed 20 instruments. I won't go through them. The only reason I put these 4 slides together is to say that we actually did the analysis. But I want to give you the quick result. And we found that there are 6 instruments that have very high potential to get to transforming rural areas. Currency swaps. Local currency bond markets are one of the most neglected parts of the financing framework and infrastructure that has been neglected till now, and something that we feel is an area that governments and banks really need to focus on. Community financing. Liquidity is actually not a problem, and I think you'll hear my co-panelists speak about this far more eloquently than I will. Most rural areas don't have a liquidity crisis. Savings rates in many rural areas are quite high, 15 to 20%, but they're just not used. Excuse me. So I'll take 2 more minutes. But they're just not used. So how can we change it? And so mobilizing that community financing is a really important part. We're also saying partial credit guarantees are required so that you can change the flow of that financing. Blended finance. One of the key things that has been promised in 2019 and 2018, when blended finance became this really cool thing to look at, was that it was going to be the big solution. But frankly, only 20 to 25% of most blended finance, and the magnitude of that blended finance is very, very small still, goes into agri-food systems. The other big challenge that we found, we couldn't find data for rural. We looked through 15 agencies. Most countries, most agencies don't disaggregate data by rural-urban. So you don't measure it, you don't treasure it. Clearly, you've got to do something in this age of data richness, and because I come from the impact measurement field, this is a big concern for me. If you don't know how much of that money is going into rural, we shouldn't have taken a whole year to figure out what that financing gap is. I thought we'd have secondary sources, we didn't. But blended finance has essentially not met a large part of the challenge that they've been directed to because they don't know the magnitude of the problem. Again, I won't go into this, but the key thing that I want to leave you with are that there are key things that banks and IFIs can also do to change it. The first thing is adjusting risk and capital adequacy frameworks. For those of you who are aware of this, and I know Amarjeet's done work on this, changing IFRS 9 and Basel IV, which essentially guide what is the amount of liquidity that banks have to keep and the capital adequacy that they have to keep, play a big role in terms of the incentives of MDBs and IFIs. Yeah. And if you change that and carefully account for rural impact and the true risk that they are facing, that will really help. In Tanzania, when the capital adequacy ratio was reduced to just 10%, the amount of lending that went into rural areas increased by 25%, right? Just a percentage point reduction in the capital adequacy ratio that was required. So that's something that we can and should be doing. We should also be thinking about what is the kind of collateral that is permitted. So digital collateral registries, so this has been done, for example, in Colombia, has really changed the way. Now you can tokenize a camera. You can tokenize your phone. You can tokenize a television set. If you can tokenize it, you know where it's going. You can use it as collateral. If you can use it as collateral, that should be something that you can borrow against, right? And that's a really important part of this changing digital economy that we've got to try and leverage and galvanize. The second idea is really about repurposing subsidies. And how can we do that? Through accounting for development impact, and thinking about subsidies far more smartly. Now, many people use the word smart subsidies a lot, but here's the idea that I want to share with you. Take subsidies, but don't direct them at commodities. Don't direct them at, oh, if you use this much fertilizer, or if you use this much electricity, we'll give you a subsidy. They should not be commodity linked. They should be income or consumption linked, because like a cash transfer, right? Then that takes away the distortion that you see, the deadweight loss that you see in a lot of economies and with households, which would then improve the way markets work as well. I'm going to stop here because I know I'm running out of time, and I'm hoping that we can pursue some of the ideas around scale economies and digitization during the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jyotsna. Thank you very much for setting the tone. And you will have opportunities to come in with some of the other thoughts that you have in the course of the question and answers. From the macro, we move to the micro now. I call upon my friend Saroj to share with us the work that PRADAN does and their vision of where they want rural development to be. Can I use this mic?
Yeah.
Can you? This mic is also work. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Vandari, for calling me and giving us the opportunity to share. First, I would like to share a movie on these partnership initiatives, which is going on in various states of central India. And then after this, I will make a summary of the presentation of our learning and experience. An excellent presentation by you. It's a very good learning opportunity. Yeah, you can start. Can we have the lights off? You can see the film better.
There is a system surrounding every social problem. Unless the key factors in the system that uphold the problem are changed, any attempt to solve it may not sustain in the long run. Multi-stakeholder partnerships are necessary to address complex problems such as hunger and poverty, as it requires diverse resources to be tapped. There are 4 initiatives around this idea that are led by government to work in partnership with NGOs and donors, where PRADAN is the lead NGO. Home to 40 million tribal citizens, the central India plateau is marked with undulating topography and declining forest cover. High runoff during monsoons causes soil erosion of precious topsoil. Therefore, tribal families can barely produce enough for subsistence. 6 districts in West Bengal are part of the central India plateau. To address the region's water challenges, the government of West Bengal launched Ushar Mukti, an ambitious program to revive the soil and rivers of these tribal areas with a team of 6 NGOs led by PRADAN. Ushar Mukti means salvation from barrenness. In this project, MG Narega resources have been leveraged to assist the recovery of ecosystem that has been degraded and destroyed, so that the livelihoods of people depending on the ecosystem can be sustained.
A typical watershed program covers about 20 watersheds. In Ushar Mukti, we were dealing with 100 times that scale.
As of today, about 2 lakh families in 2,039 watersheds of 6 districts treated the large catchments of 7 dying rivers, adopting watershed development principles. Thousands of functionaries were trained to map locations for structures, prepared detailed estimates and submit them for fund approval. Ushar Mukti has moved several important indicators in a short time. Yet, one of its most encouraging achievements is women stepping forward to take the lead.
आगे दमे कुछ तो खाली पहाड़ नहीं दिखला छे पहाड़ वाला काट आनथी गोलामपुर लेगती हाथ के झिमड़ी आछे झिमड़ी लेगे तुम
Ushar Mukti's success is the result of collective efforts of NGOs, citizens, government, funders and technology specialists. It started as a large program in a small part of the central India plateau. It can now serve as a model for the entire region, improving the life and livelihoods of tribal communities in the heart of India. High Impact Mega Watershed Project is a joint initiative taken up by Chhattisgarh government in partnership with Bharat Rural Livelihood Foundation and Axis Bank Foundation for improving rural livelihoods through soil and water conservation activities in convergence with MG Narega.
हाई इम्पैक्ट मेगा वाटरशेड प्रोजेक्ट कंसीव हुआ था अक्टूबर 2018 में और एग्रीमेंट भी अक्टूबर में ही साइन किए थे और लॉन्चिंग इस प्रोजेक्ट का जो है ना 2019 फरवरी में हुआ था.
13 civil society organizations are facilitating the community-led planning process under MG Narega and supporting the GPs in effective implementation of NRM activities by providing technical support in preparation of detailed project report.
हमारे गांव में ना पहले पानी की बहुत कमी रही से पहले मतलब आजीविका का साधन नहीं था तो सब दीदी भैया लोग यहाँ से बाहर काम करने जाते थे रायपुर धमतरी पूरा दाल चावल लेके 2 महीना 3 महीना तक. अब जब से रोजगार गारंटी में डबरी बनना शुरू है यही काम मिल जाता है उनको बाहर जाने की जरूरत ही नहीं पड़ती.
They are also involved in promoting farm-based livelihoods with the intervened households.
In Odisha, the Agriculture Production Cluster Project is being implemented in partnership with the state government and 17 civil society organizations.
आमे एपीसी थ्रू रे काम करछु जोडा कि आपनकर गोटे कन्वर्जेंसी मॉडल बा विभिन्न प्रकार डिपार्टमेंट सहित एनजीओ माने मध्य काम करूछंती जोडा कि बीआरएल ताऊ फंडिंग करछि तांगर अवेयरनेस रनिंग प्रोजेक्ट फैसिलिटेशन पाई राइट. पूर्व जो थिला गोटे सिस्टमैटिक वे काम करनथला फॉर एग्जांपल मु कहबी जदी लिफ्ट इरिगेशन गोटे वाटर सोर्स तयारी करथला ताकू फॉलो अप करिया कथा वेजिटेबल कल्टीवेशन रे ओरिसा लिफ्ट इरिगेशन काम करथला हॉर्टिकल्चर काम करथला सॉइल कंजर्वेशन काम करथला किंतु विभिन्न जगह रे अलग प्रकार भाबे काम करथले किंतु जेतेबेले एबे एपीसी आरंभ हैला सेतेबेले कोन हैला ना सब डिपार्टमेंट गोटे जगह रे कन्वर्जेंस हेकी काम करले.
The Agricultural Production Cluster Program that is being done in partnership of the government of Orissa with PRADAN and nearly 17 other NGOs is a project which is focused on doubling of farmers' income. The activities include making the farmers into farmers producer organizations, making farmers collectives. Linking these organizations to the market, as well as providing infrastructure and other support to the farmers and the farmers organization.
आउ सेथिरे हमर बिक्री पई बहुत सुविधा हैला जोटा कि हम गां को आसिला आउ ओजन करी कि हम घर सब जिंस देई पारिलु सेटा भी बाहर मार्केट को दिया हैला जा द्वारा कि हमर इनकम सोर्स बढ़िला ए पर्यंत मु 60,000 टंका इनकम करिछि.
the scheduled tribes, and other traditional forest dwellers, OTFDs, in India mostly reside in forest fringe villages or inside forests. Traditionally, these forest-dwelling communities depend upon the forest for their livelihoods in some or other forms, like practicing shifting cultivation, NTFP collection, ruminant rearing by collecting natural fodder from the forest, etc. PRADAN empowers Gram Sabhas to exercise its rights and duties and play a vital role in the claim-making and claim recognition process under FRA, starting from FRC constitution or reconstitution to approval of the claim in the final Gram Sabha. Preparing and implementing livelihood prospective community forest resource management plan for protection and restoration of community forest resources. As a result of systematic CFR management, the poor tribal and OTFD communities are now availing good quantity of uncultivated, safe and nutritious forest foods for consumption and sale, many other minor forest produces for sale and income, and also huge quantity of natural fodder for ruminant rearing. Besides, the duration of stream flow has been increased, soil moisture and soil nutrient enhanced, and community members gradually started second cropping in their agriculture land at the foothill areas. The Gram Sabha members of these program villages are now happy to see the changes, and many neighboring villages are demanding similar interventions in their villages.
So these are some of the examples of partnership initiatives that is going on in various states. But yeah, let me share the presentation now. You can start the slides. And before showing the presentation, let me share the context. Like in India, there are near about 100 million smallholder farmers, which is around 83% of the Indian farmers. The smallholder farmers means less than 2 hectares of land, and they contribute near about 70% of the entire food system of India actually. So working with these smallholder farmers is very critical. And then, they contribute near about, this agriculture contribute near about 16% of the GDP and employing near about half of the rural population. And if you see the rural youth, like the challenge is like, they're not interested in the farm-based livelihoods because the income aspiration is very high. Like recently we did a survey of the rural areas and mainly in the central India tribal regions. So there the income aspiration is near about 2.5 lakh rupees per annum. I mean, if they can earn near about 20,000 rupees per month, then they can stay in the rural areas. Otherwise, they have to migrate to the nearby cities actually. So that is the trend. So we are talking about Lakpati Didis, but I think the income aspirations is much more actually. That is 2.5 lakh rupees. And now this is the case. Like so, we have while working in the rural areas, like the priorities areas, we have selected 4 priorities areas, and that should be the, I think. I mean, we need to work on those priorities areas in a very intensive manner. So one is the strengthening the livelihoods of the rural people. So I will talk about the learning around this strengthening livelihoods. Second is the climate action, which we are saying actually the climate financing and then climate action, where the entire ecology, the regenerative agriculture, natural farming, all those factors have to be considered. Third is the gender equality. Obviously, this under NRLM, 10 crores women have been mobilized into SHGs. So I think, and this gives a very good platform to intervene around gender equality actually. So this gender responsive organization of women and gender transformative organization of women, I think we can, we should look into that. And fourth pillar is actually the nutrition and wash. So I think in the tribal areas, so we need to intervene around the nutrition specific interventions and the nutrition sensitive agriculture. So these are the 4 pillars around which our interventions are being planned actually. And I think this should be the priority area of rural India actually. And apart from health and education, I think we will be talking about that actually. So, so let me share this case in a very slightly detailed manner, like I will take near about 5 to 10 minutes. So this is the initiative called Securing the Livelihoods of Rural Poor. Yeah. So this case examines the utilization of the natural resource management, the targeted investments to the rural poor, with the livelihoods in, livelihoods in a very strong focus, and how the multi-stakeholder partnership can be done with the civil society organizations, with the community-based organizations, with the donors, with the government agencies. Leverage the flagship program of various government like MGNRG and NRLM. In most of the poorest areas like the Bastar region of Chhattisgarh. So if you see the context of the area, it's very much similar to if you see like South Odisha, South Chhattisgarh, or North Chotanagpur Plateau. So poverty level is very high, very poor land and water resources. So lots of opportunity are there to intervene in the natural resource management, lack of access to irrigation. In these areas where we intervened, the irrigation percentage was in single digit actually, 37%. So despite of all the investments from the government and minor irrigation department, so like in the South Chhattisgarh, it was 5%, and in the North Chhattisgarh, it's 11%. So which is very less. And though the national average is near about 40% actually. 40% of the net zone area is irrigated, that is the government figure. And obviously the agriculture productivity is very less, like it's 1/3 of the national average, the main crops paddy, and 82% of the small and marginal farmers. So if you see the rural areas, like mainly in the tribal region, so this is the trend of this rural area, the poverty, lack of, investments, lack of irrigations, access to finance, access to capital, and then access to market. So these are the next level of challenge actually. So this initiative was targeted around the income enhancement of 1 lakh small and marginal farming households around land and water treatment, improving the cropping intensity, and obviously the building people and the building the community institutions was one of the major focus. So around these 3 pillars, this initiative was planned. So if you see the implementation architecture, like almost all the stakeholders were involved, like there is representation from the civil society organizations, community-based organizations, then user groups, panchayats, Jilla Panchayat, and state MGNRG, and the funding agencies like Axis Bank Foundation and Ford Foundation. So these are the partners in the entire project. And I'll skip this slide, like this is the general slide, like the planning considerations, like Gram Panchayat is the unit of planning, and then micro level planning is very much important. And then these are the steps like mapping in the villages, and people do understand what are the type of resources they are having. So how to internalize the potential of these resources, that is the critical thing. So we do a very intensive mapping exercise. And these exercises have been done in 1,000 villages actually. So it's in a scale and in a landscape-based approach. Then if you see the major achievements over a period of last 4 years, like 1,000 staffs were trained, 6,000 panchayat functionaries were trained, because training and capacity building and building people was one of the major interventions. The panchayat CBO collaborations, then around the various technology like use of GIS tools and technologies, and then farm-based interventions. So this was again another pillar of interventions. Then near about 1,000 detailed project reports were prepared under this engineering, and it is a very intensive process. And we planned for near about 1.5 lakh structures actually. And these are all are in the private lands. So again, mobilizing the community around this private land was one of the challenges that the civil society organizations played a very critical role. And if you see the investments, so in the period of 2 years, more than 1,300 crores were invested for this creation of water bodies. So पहले भी ऐसा होता था, but I think this is a planned investment, and this is called the targeted investment for the specially deprived categories of people, using the scientific principles like risk to value approach. And then implementations were done by the panchayats. And if you see the water, what is the conservation, like 2.1 million liters of water were conserved actually. So this is the additional water conservation that have been done. Livelihood interventions with more than 1.5 lakh households, and 60% of the households are getting the income of more than 1 lakh rupees. So again, these are some of the major achievements. So if you see the learning, like what are the learning of this initiative? Like, so we need to do the partnership around a very big ideas. The ideas matters a lot. If you say like we'll work in 10 punches, and if you say for 1,000 punches, this is the model, then obviously government and the funders would be interested in doing the work at scale, rather than the scaling of the entire approach. And the partnership around the big ideas should be around the priorities of the people in the community, and obviously the priority of the government. So when these two combines, this is a win-win situation. Then large-scale finance and investments, that is again the need of the hour. Multi-stakeholder orchestration, like we believe that in the entire ecosystem, there are many stakeholders, and how to do the convergence and the orchestration at the grassroots level, that is the challenge actually. The fourth, which is the most important, is the community stewardship, where the locus of initiative has to be the community collectives, and how we can trigger this decentralized community action. I think these are some of the learning that around the big ideas that is there. And then I think the partnership around the CSOs, how to build the quality HR at the grassroots level. And then faster implementations, proof of concepts, like many times there are many programs, but the concepts are very good, but there are gaps in the concepts to commissioning actually. So I think this multi-stakeholder partnerships play a very important role. Then the convergence and integration actually, how to integrate the priorities of the people in the state government, national government program, the principles of working together, and how to improve the delivery of the entire flagship program like PDS, MGNRGS, MDS. So I think these are some of the learning of this initiative, and some of the photographs like those are there in the movie. So taking the entire landscape into consideration, so some of the interventions, and these are from MGNRG actually. So these type of water bodies and land use pattern were changed, and like people are going for now pisciculture also. So now they are going for 300% cropping intensity in most of the areas. Yeah, pisciculture. And in the entire process, there is a very good partnership between the panchayats and the SSGs actually. So that is again the very good achievement in some of the areas. So if I summarize what could be the broad contours of engagement under various initiatives that we do actually. Like first part is the social mobilization, where generally we with working with the NRLM, the affinity-based SSGs, they are the foundation actually, the SSGs and the village organizations, and gender-based inequalities, financial intermediation, financial inclusion. So all those factors are their intervention with the collectives actually. So we are not working with the individual households. The collective is the platform where we are intervening. We should intervene with the women's institution, the panchayats, engagement with the youth and the skill building. And second part is that logical part is the resource augmentation and the area development. So taking the entire area perspective and how we can do the natural resource management, demystify and simplify the technology so that work can be done in a very large scale, and development of livelihood prototypes, and which can be done in a very large scale, and how to leverage the various government flagship program, and how this convergence can take place at the grassroots level actually. So many a times the convergence are going on at the state level, at the national level. So there are many convergence and coordination committees. So on papers, I think excellent convergence are there. But how to do the convergence at the grassroots level, and where the community-based organizations can play a very important role. So that is the experience we are having, and that should be the the broad contours of engagement. Then next is the investment, like finances, services, the knowledge base of the households, then convergence from the various government programs, strengthening the linkages with the markets and the financial institutions and the panchayats, and then nurturing the partnership approach with the various stakeholders. And fourth is basically the livelihoods, where the productivity, income management, then markets, the economies of scale, promoting agri-entrepreneurs, and then various linking them with the various startup. I think this is the broad contours of engagement that we are suggesting for intervening in the rural areas based on our experience with working with NRLM and the Rural Development Department. So this part almost I have covered, but one part just I would like to highlight is like the production cluster approach. Whatever we are doing, it should be on a very large scale. And in Odisha, that you've seen in the movie, like the agriculture production cluster, again, it's going on in a very large scale. Yeah. And for doing all this, the building the capabilities of the people is extremely important. Otherwise, they will be dependent on PRADAN or other agencies. So it should not be very much centric to PRADAN actually or other agencies. Yeah. So this is the last slide. I think I have taken more time. Yeah. What could be the way forward? Like we think like the sustainable livelihoods, this interventions is very critical. And then for doing that ecological interventions, keeping the natural resource management, the ecology, the landscape-based approach. So all those has to be considered. Building people and community institutions are again very critical. So we are talking about the community stewardship, where the locus of initiative and the locus of control are with the community collectives. So need-based plan again is very important. It should not be a very copy-paste type of model. And demonstration, hydraulic support, the capacity building, actually, it raises the confidence of the individual households and the community collectives. Then capacity building of civil society organizations, the panchayats, government functionaries, again, it is an enabler actually. Like so how to build this entire ecosystem, again, that is very critical. Evidence-based learning, monitoring and evaluation system. Generally, many times we talk about the MEL system, like monitoring and evaluation learning, but generally it's focused on monitoring and evaluation rather than learning. So we are talking about the evidence-based learning. The learning should be the major focus actually. And for doing all this multi-stakeholder coalitions is very critical. So this is the overall, I mean, learning and experience that we have. So rest of the time I will stop here. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. You can skip the slide.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, friends. So you've heard the macro view and the micro view, how they've gone about actually painstakingly building up community organizations and institutions, and how that makes a difference. A lot of what is reported on India in recent years needs to be seen in a time frame of 15-20 years. Some of the salient changes which are happening very quietly. The breakthroughs that Saroj was talking about in the rain-fed areas are on scale. If agriculture is sustaining at a certain rate of growth, it is nothing to do with food grains. We have kind of plateaued on food grains. It is horticulture, it is animal resources, it is a whole lot of new systems and arrangements which seem to be coming forward. The other, similarly, the bridging of the gap between the urban and rural, even in terms of consumption expenditures and others, expenditures on food grains less than 50%, lower than 50%. Some of this, it is nothing very salient or major, but sustainability in some form seems to have got strength. And how, when we are talking policy making in rural areas, small things, as he rightly said, more than 85% of landholders are marginal and small farmers. Now, MG and REGS was always investing in community institutions, community pond, community forest, everything community. Why not the individual? If the individual also is poor, one of the major shifts that we pushed about 7-8 years ago, that we will go in for a large-scale individual beneficiary schemes. If you're doing a house under Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, 90 days of work is yours. You're doing a farm pond, do it. Marginal and small farmers can also do it. You're doing an animal shed, goat shed, poultry shed, do it with MGNREGA resources. So a lot of the myths of MGNREGS needs to be exploded. Because many a time, the comments which come are not based on evaluation. I say this in all humility, that many a time, in terms of what change it brings at the cutting edge level, we need to understand it a little better. And clearly, some of the changes can be explained by convergence from the bottom that Saroj said, and very rightly, unless and until civil society organizations are mainstream there, this does not work out so easily. We've had the macro view, and again, I think there was a lot of resilience, a lot of common factor elements in Saroj's presentation and in Jyotsna's presentation, because I think two great minds were thinking alike in terms of what should be the focus areas. What I'll try and do is to just share with you the larger picture of rural India and its move forward. You know, few things look very positive. When you look at the left side, the blue side, pro-poor public welfare, 415 million out of multidimensional poverty as assessed by the UNDP in its 2023 report, fastest growing economy and so on. But the challenges of income and employment, the learning poverty, since other issues have been covered, you know, if there was one marker between urban and rural, it is access to quality education. And I wish Jyotsna takes note of it in your recommendations for the world, because clearly that is making a big difference. We are currently engaged here in CSEP in a study on a public report on school education. And the more we travel, the more we see that between urban and rural, the state of schools, it has to be seen to be believed. There are challenges. The peer group that you get, because government schools, they are open for everyone. There are some kids who with great difficulty are participating in schools, but they've come to the schools. But are we able to provide them quality education? The rural-urban issue, learning poverty will determine a lot of what the final trajectory of development would be. Fragile gains in poverty reduction, the gains are very fragile. Unless and until fundamentally the productivity goes up, health improves, nutrition improves, education improves, we can sink back into poverty in no time. One dislocation of COVID, we've seen what it does. It makes your health indicators, your education indicators tumble down across the world because everything shuts. So clearly some of this differentials affect rural much more, the human capital challenge, and of course, something which India is notorious for, the public goods failure. How do we address the public goods failure? Ashoka Modi and others, all of them, when they analyze where India is and what the challenges are and why it is hard to settle, we need to address some of these, and they pan out loudest when it comes to rural India. I'll quickly just mention that rural is not only agriculture. We have discussed a lot of the sustainability issues. In India, for example, Professor Ramesh Chand published about a year and a half ago in the EPW, more than 50% of manufacturing and construction in India and more than 1/5 of the services sector is actually operating in rural India. Technically, they are in rural areas. If that is the case, what are the opportunities we've been able to develop for people who live in rural areas? I think one vision was of a urban mission. 300 clusters were taken up. Many of them have come up well, but for some reason, it has not continued as part of the government initiative. Essential idea was to be able to provide the basic infrastructure and urban-like services in rural areas. Can we visualize smaller urban agglomerations of 10, 15,000, 20,000 population? One of the clusters was the Araku Valley cluster, and it built around coffee. That Araku Valley cluster is doing quite well today. We had 10 or 12 tourism clusters. Some of them, because a lot of the funding came from convergence of existing programs. But existing programs have very little untied funds at the bottom line. As a consequence, it's not easy to draw those resources because those resources are already committed for something else. So I think what is required is a systems thinking for sure, because sectors talk to each other when we talk about rural. I will just quickly come to lessons from the world. Just 2 slides. This is familiar to all of you because I've shared it before. Who says that economic development and social development are not related? Look at when Japan achieved universal primary education for girls, turn of the 20th century. South Korea, 60s. China, 1980s. We are struggling to do it at the turn of the 21st century. And look at the economic profiles of the nations. But more importantly, how China addressed the problem. China did not address the problem of poverty primarily through poverty alleviation strategies. It had a more broad-based economic transformation strategy. As most of you would know, China brought out about 800 million people out of poverty over a 25-year period. And during that period, 4 broad-based economic transformation principles, they also need to figure in rural debates now. Because urbanization or better connectivity with urban clusters often brings down poverty much more than any agriculture initiative. In fact, one of the studies I recall having looked at on poverty, which said that probably PMGSY brought down poverty more than many poverty alleviation programs, because it allowed for poor people from villages to participate in urban economies and earn higher wages. So growing agricultural productivity was the focus in China as well. Incremental industrialization is what they focused right from the very beginning. That poverty programs cannot be an end in itself. That we have to mainstream development in such a manner, managed urbanization and rural-urban migration. We can't do it. China can, because China doesn't follow the democratic principles. Most Chinese have not seen their cities because you need a pass for that. You need an entry for that. You can't stay on in an urban area without the pass. It's a controlled effort. Their cities don't come up like our census towns, that they grow and then we think of it. A lot of the urbanization in China has been a planned one. Invest in infrastructure, do everything else, and then bring in all the production, manufacturing that you want to bring in there. So clearly, the approach has been a little different. And the infrastructure thrust was there also, but they have also had poverty alleviation strategies, area-based poverty alleviation, social protection policies as well, and targeted poverty alleviation strategy for the poorest households. But by and large, they have factored urbanization and economic growth through manufacturing and other services as a part of their poverty reduction strategy. Just last slide, I'll not share the other ones. In our own country, when we look at southern India, we often remark that the multidimensional poverty is much lower there. As we know, Kerala, as per the Niti Ayog's assessments in 2023 and the UNDP's assessment, 0.55% are multidimensionally poor in Kerala, though it is 11th on the per capita income. Tamil Nadu, 2.2%. Karnataka, 7.4%, and so on. So clearly, there are some factors which seem to have made a difference. And when we are doing the rural-urban analysis, we need to bear these in mind. High adolescent girls' participation in higher secondary and higher education is the real marker. In whichever province of India that happened first on scale are the provinces where the per capita consumption expenditures are also higher today, which means incomes are also higher in those very states: Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Goa, Himachal Pradesh, Sikkim. So there is a correlation. The other correlation, of course, is of decentralization, which has been talked about by Saroj. Decline in fertility, improvement in healthcare services, formation of women's self-help groups, which you already discussed, livelihood diversification through skills, and bank linkage for self-help groups. A very simple, easy to do instruction of the Reserve Bank of India 30 years ago by Dr. C. Rangarajan has transformed this space. No collaterals, no mortgage. Jyotsna talked about looking at the banking and credit. You know, across Africa and India, there is evidence that wherever collectives are involved, even if you don't have mortgages, you still have a better return. You still have a lower non-performing asset you still have far more timely repayments. But this principle is not a part of the banking system as yet. It's only experimental. From 10 lakhs, you raised it to 20 lakhs now. There is, you've talked about credit guarantee program. That's one of the things where I must say that the financial services department has been very proactive. It does work well, up to 20 lakhs now. 10 lakhs, of course, is collateral free. The other 10 lakhs you can borrow. And there is a credit guarantee mechanism that is in place, which is paid for, which just in case it doesn't work. All the lending, $1 trillion lending to the women's collectives over the last 11 years, the NPA is 1.34%. Just 1.34. It needs to be talked about more. And clearly for our rural resilience, those are instruments of community collectives, social capital being used for, for example, simple mechanism. If 20 people take a mudra loan, 10 may default. But if those same 20 people do so after a detailed microcredit plan was prepared for each of them, what are their assets, what are their liabilities, what are their debts, and so on, perhaps not 10, but only 2 will default. If further, there was an arrangement whereby the money transferred to the account, not of the individual, but of the collective, as it happens in the women's self-help groups, a community enterprise fund. If it transfers through a collective account and then goes to individuals, there is far greater moral responsibility to return that money. The repayments are much better. So some of these nuances need to be understood. What is it that is likely to get us higher value for money? What is it that is going to make credit sustainable? Because otherwise, rural credit has a way of getting choked up because we keep pumping in money, but we don't get the returns that we want. And these need to be factored as we move on. I'll just stop here. Many issues, but we'll just stop here and open it for debate and discussions from all of you. I'm sure you have a lot of questions to ask. Thank you. All yours. Any questions, any issues that any of you would like to flag? Yeah. You can sit and ask your questions. You can introduce yourself and just your question.
Hello. Sir, I'm Mahapatra. I'm a former officer of Indian Economic Service. I worked in the Ministry of Rural Development and the Ministry of Panchayati Raj, and has written a lot on this rural governance. My recent book is Rural Local Governance and Development, that I'm revising that. That is also one of the reasons to come here, to empower myself about the rural development. And I learned a lot, but I have some issue in my mind that I want to share. One is that the madam presented an excellent presentation at the global level. But one thing that I am seeing, living in the rural area and very actively involved with the people, that institution may also be considered as an important component. Even this year Nobel Prize in Economics is also an institutional building. And that is really not taking place in rural area. It is panchayat institutions. We talk about the convergence, where convergence is already there. Constitutional provisions are there, institutions are there, but that is not being used. So that institution building is very important. Recently, cooperatives, that is also a lot of corruption is there. The ports is purchased by 3 lakhs, 4 lakhs, 5 lakhs. Where is the corruption? Where is the cooperation? Nothing. I want to share that in my village, the boy asked me, sir, come to vote me, because I'm also a farmer. So I didn't go. Well, we have some other agency, but I came to know that he demanded 3 lakhs rupees to vote for the director.
You'll have to brief your question.
So one thing is, second, that about 71%, madam, you said about the central government. But what is the ratio that the rest would be the state government? I think so. Probably.
All governments were 71%, not central. All governments are
all gone.
Central state.
Where is the share of, in contest in India, local self-government? Can you study that? Or if you like, that will be give more idea about that.
Thank you.
Sir, I have one question.
Can you, because other people also have questions, we have limited time, so we would like.
Just one question. About the, this livelihood and sustainable development, I personally felt that why this agriculture is not in rural area. Thing is that the farmers are engaged only farming. They are not engaged into other activity, that is processing and marketing. There are models where the families engage in three activities, that is and madam, about the institution that FEOs have been formed. 40% are different. They are not working.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
you. Time is short.
In all the three presentations, let me be a bit challenge you a bit. I didn't see any markets. Almost as if there is a state and the state needs to do these things. You go in, and the people in rural areas are these completely people with no energy, and you go in and you build an SHG and you go in, you help them out. And so it was, where is the energy in rural India? How are you letting it flower by itself? I mean, or how are you enabling it?
Yeah.
Hi, very interesting presentation.
Sorry, what's your name?
Priyadarshini, I'm a research fellow at CSEP. So in the sectors that you highlighted that are actually receiving a lot of funding is health and education as far as rural is concerned. But one would intuitively think that areas such as food security or biodiversity or energy would be the first priority call for funding. So how would you say, what kind of drivers have sort of channeled the funding towards health and education versus these other areas, which to me, the first thing you would do is food security, livelihoods. And what could be the drivers to sort of channel the kind of funding you're suggesting in these deficit areas?
Yeah, yes, Rita.
Thank you both the panelists for a very nice presentation and discussion. Question to Jyotsna. I was curious to know, how do you envisage local bond markets servicing this segment, particularly because agriculture is such a hugely risky activity and it's getting riskier with so many of climate shocks on the rise and the frequency and the volatility. And second is on the changing of these IFRS and Basel IV rules, and so as to facilitate MDPs and IFIs. To my mind, it is linked to, again, the changing of, accommodating these rules so that to increase, accommodate rural impact and so on. There are issues about measurement, and there's also issue of transferring risks to the banks. And I'm not sure that governments would be very happy with doing that, or if it's a safe thing. Both.
So we'll take up these 6 questions and then we'll come back again for the next round. Should we take up all at one go? We'll respond to these 6, then we'll take.
Actually, mine is a bit related to Lavish.
Yes, why don't you ask?
Yeah, so it's like, you see, there is the private sector. So all these collaborations, not taking them in. So what is your experience? How is this going to impact the private sector? And can they do something to get this offline? Like, what do you think the future may be? Is it possible for the CSOs to hand over it to the local bodies and move on to other areas? So that's.
Would you like to start?
Sure. Great question. Thank you.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So first, I think, Mahipal, your questions. First, I should say that the key focus of the development report is really on changing the financing that is getting directed to rural. So we're not looking at the demand side. So many of the questions that you're asking in terms of institution building, etc., definitely really important. We're not looking at the demand side because that just would open up an entire box of issues that we weren't ready to deal with. But the other thing is, and it also relates to Lavish's question and also the question that you're asking in terms of markets. I think, well, we didn't get to the second part, but one of the key things that we are also exploring is this idea that look, with tokenization, with an increased digital footprint, you have a completely new market. Just as a complete aside, I was in Cambodia and I was speaking with the advisor to the prime minister at that point in a late night sort of Chatham House Rules dinner. And they were talking about moving essentially entire populations, rural populations, because they are smallholder farmers to urban areas. And my question became, and this was I think the provocation that Lavish provided right at the beginning, my question was what is the role of government in a context like this? Is this to increase growth, or you could adopt the Kerala model, for simplicity, I'm going to call it that, where you decouple the human development indicators from growth indicators, right? And the important thing is really recognizing that with digitization and tokenization, you have new markets that have scale economies that you can essentially hedge against one another. Everybody has a token. Now, as an investor, it is better for me to invest in each one of you individually rather than treat you as one individual, because now my risk actually diminishes, right? I have an immediate hedge in the fact that now I have 20 agents versus one agent, and my entire portfolio is dependent on one agent. So that context, the kind of market that we're dealing with, primarily because we've become more tokenized and digitized, has changed. So that's the energy of small is now actually beautiful, and fragmentation is good because it leads to e-scale economies. And that was sort of the third point that I was going to come to in the second part of my presentation, which was really thinking about markets in a very different way, where you are creating these e-scale economies. That's the first. And second, also thinking about, and so, sorry, there was, so of course, infrastructure and DPI investment, and Amarjeet spoke about that. But I think the key thing is that the second is leveraging farmers' organizations, civil society organizations, and really ensuring that they have the kind of capacity that allows both NBFIs, so non-banking financial institutions, but also financial institutions to take care of it. Sorry, I'm going to, for brevity, just come very quickly to this idea of changing banking regulations that I think Renu asked. And the key thing is recognizing that, look, the indebtedness that most developing countries facing today is well known. A large part of that is also occurring, well, because most of the debt that countries take is dollar debt. And that, because of devaluation, because of depreciation of currencies, and because of a whole lot of other contextual factors that are affecting the volatility of these currencies that are non-dollars, you're essentially changing the amount and the quality of that debt. If you start to think about mobilizing or thinking about local currency bond markets, you essentially can galvanize both the savings and the liquidity in rural and non-rural spaces. But second, you don't have to be dependent on international dollar markets for essentially taking a lot of debt, right? So I think that is a key idea that is really predicated, of course, on macroeconomic and fiscal stability, which India benefits from, and so not all economies, so DRC, not to be repeated outside, is probably not a country where I would build a local currency bond market, or Gabon is not one of those, but definitely India is a country where I would, really scale up local currency bond markets, because you can galvanize a lot of the local savings. And with Basel IV and IFRS, again, experiments have been done with many countries. So there is a difference between perceived risk and actual risk. In many countries, and I've worked now with blended platforms that have worked in Africa, but also in India and outside, the perception of risk, and I think Amarjeet used the statistic, a lot of the default rates in a lot of ag and non-ag, but rural lending is actually quite low. But the perception of that risk outside, when you're bringing in, say, external lenders, is extremely high. So first, you've got to adjust your risk appetite to what is actual, and I think you know this. But the second part is for rural development, because there are clear benefits of rural investment, alter the overall incentive structure within banks. So like ESG, that's the ultimate argument. Like ESG, if we are providing incentives for ESG investments, we should be able to provide incentives for development impact in rural areas as well. And that's the other side of that argument. I'm going to stop here so that I can have both of those, the other panelists.
Yeah, I think most of the points you have covered. Just on the market part, I would like to respond. Like market is obviously it's a very critical interventions in the entire scenario. Like we think like the local and micro level solutions are important, but looking at the complexities of the problem, we need to see this larger ecosystem actually. And this market, the startups, the agri entrepreneurs, so these are very critical players. So like in the production cluster approach, so we are linking the smaller farmers to the market actually. So many of the startups are coming and then, yeah.
It's actually a question.
Yeah.
We have once a few great examples get created, why don't we see these things emerge spontaneously? What is it? Why is there this lifelessness? Why do you have to intervene?
So yeah, so I'm coming to that point. Like that point is linked to your point actually. What you asked, like this economic collective of women. If you see, the government of India has promoted this. This 10,000 FPO schemes, the farmer producer organizations. So many stakeholders are involved in organizing the women into this farmer producer company. So like if you see the overall status of FPOs and FPCs, so it's not working well actually. Like the reasons are many, like the markets are there, but see the production productivity frontiers are not stable. And there are like if the market is coming, the traders need near about 50 metric ton or 100 metric ton of vegetables or millets or the commodities should be identified. So if we can identify the winner crops based on the community's priorities and the market traders' priorities, then that would be the win-win situation. So our experience has been like, so in 10%, 15% cases, this matches actually. Otherwise, see in the areas where there are investments are going, but if you see like dragon fruits cultivations can be done, but there is no market. So one need to intervene, like enter the subsector actually, starting from like in sericulture. So this has been done very intensively. And there is an initiative called soil to silk actually. So starting from plantation to the fabric, so all in the entire value chain, so the interventions have been done. And this type of interventions are successful. And many times the processing units, like last year was the International Years of Millet. But if you see the trend of millets, so that is deteriorating actually. So because people are going for other crops, because the MSP is much higher in paddy and other crops, but in millets, they're not getting. So I think if some of the policy level decisions can be made and say this millets processing unit can be taken up in a very micro level, at the village level or at the panchayat level, then this would actually help the farmers to go for large scale production and at the same time marketing.
Can I quickly just add to that very quickly? 2 points. One, I completely agree. Markets can take care of a lot, but not all. Right. So you need public infrastructure also to develop a lot of markets. And so I think that's where government needs to come in and play a role. And there's a symbiotic relationship between public and private. And that's why, we are pushing for increased investment or redirected investment. But I think the other challenge also becomes that there are many parts that, of course, that markets don't take care of, right? Equity. They don't care about resilience. And and even in the high value chains that Saroj is talking about, you need a whole lot of a different kind of infrastructure that markets and private actors don't provide, and which is, so for example, blended finance can really take care of it, where the lower level of that overall framework or that paradigm would be taken care of by, say, government or public actors, take on, say, with grants or 0% interest loans, and take a lot of the risk, de-risk it, perhaps even provide public infrastructure, but the senior and the junior investment tranches would be essentially taken on by private actors.
If I could respond to your question, Lavish, the most provocative question gets most time. Three ways in which I look at it. Saurabh Mukherjee at IIM Bangalore He has done about 15 case studies across South Asia, looking at some of these. Why is it that the best of private sector enterprises in rural India have had a component of public funding as well? And the answer which he gives across, from Selco, many of the good initiatives he's analyzed. And the point he has made is that when you do it only by the market principles, even good, not philanthropic, but economic models have challenges which are unforeseen and they never can go to scale. If you want a good idea to go to scale, some public funding helps that process. I'll illustrate this by a second example. The livelihood mission does not give 1 rupee of subsidy. Not 1 rupee of subsidy. By spending 10,000 crores a year, we leverage 1.5 to 2 lakh crores of bank loans. So the work in terms of actual, one constraint which was coming up in rural, as you are aware, agriculture lands cannot be mortgaged. And the land on which my buildings and houses are, the Abadi land, there are no land records. As a consequence, for a rural householder to borrow from banks at the rates at which urban people borrow to mortgages, that was non-existent. That was not possible. As a consequence, you have the housing finance company charging 30% and people still going there. Those are the risks of rural. Now, with the Swamitva card, which has been, we pushed last about 7-8 years, still going further, which banks have started recognizing as an identity of property. The card which they get, where essentially through drone surveys, you've got all the Abadi land surveyed and given them property rights, property cards. If this happens on scale, it will take away one of the constraints to what you are saying, a market-based development in rural. This was coming in the way. The technological solution, along with a ground truthing by local communities, many states, Haryana, for example, has completed it across the state. Many states have completed it now. And banks have started lending against this. It will make a difference. The third example which I want to give, the producer company example, not a cooperative example, but a producer company. In rural areas, a lot of women's social capital was there. We had very little economic activity. Then we started drawing in partners, whether it was PRADAN or whether it was the NDDB services. Can you set up in Bihar and Madhya Pradesh, Supal, Madhepura and other areas, dairy producer companies? Now, dairy producer company is more democratic than a cooperative because every person, irrespective of how much milk they pour, they have one vote. But more importantly, we said we will not give any public subsidies on the coolers that you need and all that. Equipment you borrow from bank. What we will give you is professional skills. We'll give you technology managers, build technology people, we'll give you sales managers, we'll give you all the HR that you need for 3 to 5 years. But let the producer company be able to meet the costs thereafter. We tried this experiment in 5 places. Bundelkhand, 7 districts of Bundelkhand was the biggest one, where 68,000 women came together in something called a Balini Milk Producer Company. It was set up in 2018. Today, the total earning which they have 68,000 members in 7 districts. 588 crores is the amount of revenues, monies that they have received for the milk that they have poured. I'm giving this example because there's not 1 rupee of subsidy here, no capital subsidy. But it's a market-driven thing, but with support in the sense the HR support. So either in the form of HR or in the one component of some public subsidy seems to be the model that seems to work better because it's an unequal exchange and an unequal partnership at that time. That's the point I wish to. In fact, we have somebody who's worked on this and he's raised his hand. I find somebody whose name I always, please, would you like to introduce yourself?
I work with the National Rural Livelihood Mission earlier with sir, now part-time with them. Most of my career was in the private sector. I worked with retail, was with the Future Group. Towards the back end of my career, moved to the social sector. To answer your question, most of the private sector works on risk-free capital in the form of equity. The poor do not get access to risk-free capital. As sir ne bola, we do not give subsidies. Uska paisa kya hai? Either they borrow or it's their own money. And typically, most rural enterprises are able to compete by subsidizing the rich with the only thing they have is their own wages. They don't have access to technology. Their cost of capital is much higher. They don't have access to risk-free capital in form of equity. Their productivity is low. And we expect them to be as cheap as China imports. So what effectively these people do is, be it a farmer, be it a handicraft producer, be it anybody, be it even a wage worker, the person competes in the market by knowing one thing which he does, sleep on an empty belly or a partially filled belly. So uske liye rural India, scattered locations have been neglected by nature. जहां अच्छी जमीन थी, पानी था, पुराने जमाने में सिविलाइजेशन वहां से आई. जहां नहीं है, रेगिस्तान है, जंगल है, आबादी नहीं है, सर, it does not make market, it makes no economic sense for any marketer to go there. Even today, FMCG companies do not have distributors in rural India. Their distribution is limited to something like a 10,000 or 15,000 population. Beyond that, the individual has to carry it on his own cost. So rural India, especially scattered India, and that would be true across, are cases of market failure. It needs the government to work on it. The way in a democracy you create a voting booth for one individual, you need to provide goods and access to services. पैसा अपने आप नहीं आता, सब लोग पकाता है. The day we start saying economic activity is equally important. If Himachal says, I will not give you water unless you give me this much, do you allow these guys to charge market prices for the same way in market? If I have resources, I can command the market. Do I allow Himachal Pradesh or Arunachal Pradesh to say, I will not let water down unless you pay me market price or demand a higher price? We don't. So certain natural resources, we as people with Angrezi speaking this thing or so-called policy affecting people, the stuff that the rural India has or people have, the resources they have, we deliberately keep their prices low or say it is public goods, so you don't have a right on it. Everything else is market driven. So market failure, sir, government को address करना पड़ेगा, community market address नहीं करता है. And as a person who run businesses and worked in rural businesses, worked with rural India, my first priority there was not community benefit, not producer benefit. My first priority there was profit and return to the equity investor. And that return to the equity investor is what spoiled the MFI industry. Very good concept, right?
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, one of the key things that we're looking at is if you really want to drive those markets, you've got to have true cost accounting and you've got to have, pricing of otherwise externalities. Otherwise, you're not going to drive the kind of investment that you need in a lot of these areas as well.
What Ricky did not tell you all, he designed the program called the Startup Village Entrepreneurship Program,
SPAP,
which has supported more than 200,000, more than that, 2 lakhs earlier number. It's been evaluated. What have they done? The model is quite simple. The model is about enterprise. Not just the women from the SHG, even a man from that house can get that loan.
Right.
But that loan comes with the community enterprise fund is there. There is a community resource person for enterprise promotion, where EDI, Kudumshri, all of them have been trainers and capacity builders. There is market information. There is access to bank credit, but there is a full end-to-end support for that activity. The evaluation done by the QCI for the first 200,000 cases, each one of them had made profits. The scale of financing from being very small had gone up because there is also this community enterprise fund, which brings it that link about a social responsibility that you better return it. If borrowed, you better return it. So some of these networks, which Rekhi had helped us design, many principles of the private sector, can we do it in a community mode is the real challenge. Sorry. Yes, please, Deepak.
Deepak Maheshwari with CSEP. So you did mention, and in one of the slides you had mentioned that, for example, in the telecom sector, 30% is the actual investment, where 70% is the gap. And we do have universal service obligation funds in India, US, many places around the world, in some form or the other. For example, in India itself, unfortunately, I'm saying unfortunately, for more than 21 years now that this fund is there, every year the corpus is increasing. That means we are collecting more than what we are disbursing effectively. But in this type of scenario, one of the ways these type of things are working right now in India is we are providing subsidies to the telcos to put the infrastructure. But we are not really providing any support on the demand side to the consumers in terms of the devices or for that matter, their data tariff plans, etc. So if something could be done in that respect, that not only provide subsidy to the supply side in terms of infra, like towers and fiber, etc., but also provide subsidies to the specific consumer segments. You can sort of, if we can do DBT at scale, we can also do even this through DBT to provide these things in terms of, let's say, device support and tariff plans. Plus, apart from that, of course, the community enablement in terms of how do you use these things. So, for example, you talked about tokenization and other things. So how do people sort of know how to use these technologies and also remain safe? Thank you.
There's one more question from Prasanna. Yeah, the last question.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. I have a question for Dr. Joe and for Saroj as well. So, Dr. Joe, you had mentioned the use of direct cash transfers as one of the ways in which to move forward in terms of addressing rural elevation. Do you think there is also a larger impediment to the same due to corruption and lack of basic facilities affecting saving capacity from cash transfers, which is seen in Andhra Pradesh and in Telangana in India itself? So how do we reflect on that? Specifically, also to Saroj, you had mentioned the importance of Forest Rights Act. I wanted to know your experience in terms of the concerns due to the declaration of new reserve areas and then the migration of entire communities from their own lands. Does that also affect the manner in which the programs that you have set up are further implemented in these regions because of new reserves being declared without notices so often? Thanks.
Should we? Okay, and sorry, Priya, I forgot your question. How can we drive more resources into food security and biodiversity and livelihoods? And what I want to say is that, again, I'm not trying to, I don't want to go into the demand side because that's a longer question. But the key thing there is actually there is, if you compared food security, biodiversity, health, education, and all of the 15 sectors that we have, there is quite a bit, there are 50% of the needs with respect to food security are going into food security and nutrition right now. But the need is so high that you've got to then think about what the gap is. So the gap is 50%, right? But the overall absolute amount far outstrips everything else that's going on compared to the other sectors. And, you know, the other point is also that, and this is one of the key penny drop moments for me, a large part of the literature confounds agriculture with rural and rural with agriculture. This finding that actually there are huge non-ag sectors that exist in rural, and not just in India, across the world, was really big. I mean, for a lot of us sitting there, and I've worked in India. I mean, I've been to Chhattisgarh, I've looked at the NREGA program and the NRLM, etc. But really across the world, finding this pattern was really important. So I think the key thing is, how can you really drive? And part of the answer needs to come also from, I think, pricing. Pricing a lot of the externalities, and you can look at the Dasgupta review, etc., that will also look at biodiversity and the benefits. So I think that is one. And so I'm going to take the question on infrastructure. Deepak, I think you asked. And use of technologies. And I'd love to see a discussion between you and Lavish here in terms of, well, should there be resources that are going to subsidize the demand side? I have to say, I take a little bit more of an ideological view, which is more on Lavish's side. I think that, supply does create its demand. There says law says that. And I think that a large part, if you are as a public agency or as a government able to provide, as Mariana Mazzucato also talks about, this symbiotic relationship, if you're able to create a lot of that supply of services, demand will come in. I think it's a matter of time, but a longer discussion. And last response on the cash transfers. I can talk endlessly about cash transfers, by the way. From the 1990s, when cash transfers were first brought about in Mexico, there was so much of cynicism around cash transfers. People don't know how to use them. They'll be used in alcohol. There'll be lots of corruption. There'll be leakage, right? What we have found actually, targeting does work with cash transfers. And now, again, I'm a big technology file. So there was a fantastic evaluation of a program that was done, I think, in either Orissa or West Bengal, where you essentially, because you were digitizing everything and the flow of resources from the center straight to the last mile, or what you want to call the first mile, it reduced the leakage from the system by 25%, but it had no impact whatsoever on the last mile getting the cash transfers that they were deserving. So I think we're looking at a very different era as well, where I think cash transfers, along with the other elements of what is the ultra graduation from poverty program that Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo have spoken about, you should be thinking about skills development, livelihood trainings, etc., and creating packages. And you should be leveraging technology today so that that leakage in the system is removed. Thanks.
So, yeah, I will be very brief looking at the time. So I think this Forest Right Act, actually, that Community Forest Resource Management, I mean CFRR, Community Forest Resource Management Plan. So that should be the focus, actually. Like in Odisha, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, where the forest resources is more than 40% of the geographical area. So there, I think where the community action is there, and then Community Forest Resource Management Plan is in the focus. Only by giving the land to the forest dwellers, I don't think that it's going to suffice the purpose. There will be deforestation and like that. But how to use this forest resource for their livelihoods and the conservation and the restoration with focus and livelihood with major focus. So I think those type of plan is to be made and those type of investments is to be made by the forest department. So that is our experience. And we are doing very intensive this Community Forest Resource Management Plan with the help of Forest Department and the Department of Tribal in these 3 states, where forest resources is one of the major sources of livelihood. And if our experience has been like, if the farm-based interventions is going on very well, then there is less pressure on the forest, actually. So that is again how to complement this land-based, farm-based livelihoods plus this forest-based livelihoods. So again, that should be this entire resources has to be taken into consideration, keeping the ecology into the main principle, actually, the ecological restorations. Yeah.
Thank you, Saroj. Thank you, Jyotsna. We have gone beyond our time. Apologies for that. But I think some of the discussions were very, very useful. And it's always good to be a moderator where you can keep diverting the question to the other panelists. Thank you very much. We'll close here.